recent Supreme Court decision could have and will have deep implications for working men and women all across this country, and there has been and continues to be an ongoing legislative assault on the rights of working people to organize and improve their lives. Here to talk about the ruling and the legislative agenda with us now is Roy Houseman. Roy is a legislative representative for the United Steelworkers, which recently had, I believe, if I recall correctly, its annual meeting here in Washington, D.C. So first of all, Roy, thanks for coming on the program.
No, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And was I right? Did you guys have your annual meeting?
Yeah. So we had our annual legislative conference, our rapid response conference. We had 650 trade unionists come in from all over the country, and actually a few international delegates as well to come in and discuss three primary issues that we regarding retirement security, protecting pensions, expanding Social Security, and improving workers' rights through the Wage Act and the Workplace Democracy Act, and then obviously on trade issues as well.
And I want to talk about all those agenda items if we can, because they're all extremely important in my opinion. But I want to start with this. Okay, the Supreme Court decision really recently made a ruling on arbitration, and what does that mean for American workers?
So this case really is sets a very dangerous precedent going forward of prohibiting workers to really band together and create to basically find recourse from employers that are, not paying them the proper wages, being able to work, mass sexual harassment cases, those kinds of items where workers were trying to, they couldn't resolve individual items. So by banding together, they could actually pool their resources and, much like a union, collect enough resources to bring forward a case and bring forward, be able to try and find some an ability to find a way to move forward and have some sort of justice.
Because it's really, to me, it seems like it's a mismatch. You have an individual worker, for example, who's been mistreated in some way or has a complaint up against a corporation. The corporation has massive financial resources. Now, maybe hundreds or thousands of individual workers have the same complaint, but if you make it impossible for them to pool their resources, there's really no way an individual worker can stand up against a corporation. That's my reading of this.
Absolutely. I mean, every union, if you're in a union, every local union has a grievance procedure and an arbitration procedure. But the reason that we're able to go through that grievance and arbitration, if we have to go to an arbitration board, we're able to at least pool resources as a union, and the members each there are paying into it. But for a lot of workers, particularly in retail, where there isn't a union, or in other environments where there isn't this opportunity, the ability for you as an individual to seek regress from the government is being severely limited and being basically privatized. I mean, and that's a key piece here, is that by forcing these workers to go to forced arbitrations and mandatory arbitrations, you're creating a separate court system, and it's absolutely unfair for basic American workers and one of the basic protections that we expect under our Constitution and laws.
And these separate sort of privatized court systems, it's a lot like the way people sign away their rights when they sign a telecommunications contract, a phone contract, or a cable TV contract, any other corporate contract. The people doing the arbitrating tend to be lawyers and other people who do a lot of business with the corporations. The decisions tend to lean heavily toward the corporation and against the individual. So what can people do? Obviously, unionizing is one response wherever people can, right? What are some other things people can do to push back on this?
Obviously, the best part about our legislative system and the way our process is set up is that Congress can change the law. They can overrule the Supreme Court through changing the law to try and say that the intent is to allow workers to band together, and that the NLRB process that this entire court case was based off of was the right path. And so by Congress intentionally moving forward, and obviously the best way to do that is ensure that we have elected officials that are willing to listen and willing to move forward in this. This is something that people should definitely ask about, because when half of workers are forced into arbitration panels, and that's really what we're talking about now. Almost half the workforce is has an arbitration clause in their employment contracts. And to have this sort of broad scope arbitration stuff, it prevents you to access your right as a citizen towards legal regress.
So one way to approach it is with legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of legislation, then why don't we talk about some of the other legislative initiatives you guys are pushing? You mentioned let's start with, well, pick one.
Okay.
I'll pick one. Expanding Social Security.
So United Steelworkers recognizes that retirement security is a critical issue for every American, and the idea is to ensure that at one point 1 in 2 Americans before Social Security lived in poverty, and this has prevented Social Security has prevented millions of Americans, 22 million Americans would be below the poverty line if it wasn't for Social Security. And so our effort now is to highlight that when you have close to 40% of Americans are expecting to use the majority of their retirement savings just from Social Security, it means that there is a significant deficit of retirement savings for Americans, and the best way of handling it is to improve our social safety net, and particularly with Social Security. So with the Social Security Expansion Act put forward by Senator Sanders, that bill would basically raise the cap, which is right now any worker, or if you make over $127,000 a year, roughly, you stop paying Social Security taxes. Anything after that there's no tax on Social Security. And so the Sanders bill says anyone over $250,000 would start paying back into that, raising that cap, and putting a significant amount of revenue, long-term saving the Social Security program, and ensuring millions of people don't fall into poverty. And for us, this is just common sense, particularly for workers that work in manufacturing settings. Well, they spend 30 years toiling over physical. Look, I used to work in a paper mill. And we used to go in and out of the shipping. I worked in the shipping department. We would load boxcars, and then we would move those boxcars, and I would jump up and off the boxcars and couple them together. Now imagine doing that for 30 years. That's going to impact your knees, your body, your entire, and to have that ability to retire with some dignity is really a key thing for the union. And to expand Social Security will provide an ability for our workers to actually be able to retire. And so, and not have to worry about how they're gonna pay for rent and how they're gonna pay for the meals.
And I couldn't agree more. First of all, if you look at the statistics of how hard it's been for people to save, if you look at the fact that roughly half of all Americans say it would be difficult to come up with $400 if they had an emergency of some kind, and yet you have people lecturing, well, you should save more. People are struggling just to get by, so I agree with that. You know what else would help, in addition to expanding Social Security, which I support 1,000%, you know what else would help would be better wages for working people in this country. So what are you guys working on there?
So from the labor movement's perspective, the best way of raising wages is to form a union. And when you look at the differential between union and non-union pay, it's significant. It's over $200 per month for most workers. And then that differential actually increases if you're a minority and you're in a union versus if you're not. And so forming a union is like a key piece and component. Unfortunately, the way that our labor laws have been produced, the National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935, and there hasn't been a lot of significant updates. And quite frankly, there's been, over the years, this can be continued to be watered down. And for us, a bill called the Wage Act and the Workplace Democracy Act are two pieces of legislation that we decided to support. The Wage Act particularly will triple damages for illegal firings, and I'll give you a really good example. We went to Cumho Tire. It was a tire plant in Macon, Georgia, and we got 80% of the cards signed there. So in a union election, you need to show interest by signing cards. And so 80% of the workforce signed cards. And we filed to have an election or get voluntary recognition, which any company can do. And the company forced an election, and then they basically committed to psychological warfare on these workers. It was absolutely devastating hearing this even from DC and getting reports back where workers were subject to mandatory meetings both in the morning and in the evening. So you're working a 12-hour shift, and then you have to tack on 2 hours on top of that to have propaganda pushed at you. They then took the union supporters and put them all on one shift so that they could pick out and individually isolate those that are the most supportive of the union to keep them from other workers. And then we went from 80% card sign to losing the vote by 15 votes after almost a solid month of this sort of interference. Now, we've filed petitions and we've tried to make an effort to, and we filed unfair labor practices, but those take over a year to do. And the lead activist at that site, he went into his graveyard shift the weekend after the election, came out Monday morning, and they pulled him aside and they fired him. No justification. And we've got the unfair labor practice charge, but the maximum penalty for this employer, is to reinstate him and then pay him any back wages minus whatever wages he made somewhere else. So the employer's incentive to eliminate the ability for us to form a union by eliminating supporters through intimidation and firing is great versus the ability for us to show that what the economic power is of forming a union in the near term. And the ability to even get to a contract. This is just to vote. So the Wage Act would triple the damages for unfair labor practices. It would have additional accountability issues related to anti-union consultants is what we call, or basically when an employer hires anti-union consultants that they would have to disclose information. These are the kinds of things that we feel are really important to move forward in Congress.
And some of these anti-union consultants are real sharks. I have encountered some of those people over the years. So what about the Workplace Democracy Act?
So the Workplace Democracy covers a lot of the same issues as the Wage Act, but it goes one step farther with the ability to have voluntary recognition through card authorizations. So in most countries, if you want to form a union, like in Canada, all you have to do is fill out enough cards and then you submit it to the employer and you have a union. And in most European countries, this is the same way. In the United States, workers fill out these cards and the employer forces them to go through an entire election process that is wholly unnecessary, because unions, just as easily as people can get into a union by signing cards, they can get out of a union by signing cards. And that's one thing that they never really talk about, is that if their union isn't representing them well, they have an opportunity to either change unions or an opportunity to find a way to become, to non-unionize if they aren't being represented fairly. And I think that that oftentimes gets lost. And so those kinds, and it also eliminates prohibitions on secondary boycotts. Things that we need to really discuss again as corporations have gotten bigger. We need to be able to hold them accountable in all their subsidiaries.
See, a lot of people don't realize that the notion of boycotting, which seems to me to be sort of a basic form of expression, that I don't like the way this company is treating its workers, I'm going to publicly say I'm not going to buy their stuff. There are limitations on how much you can do that, right, as an organization.
That's correct. When we talk about free speech goes to a very limited door, and I think that a lot of people forget that as soon as you enter the workplace, you've basically lost all your free speech protections. And the only ways to actually maintain them is through unionization. Because you're an at-will employee in almost 49 states, or 48. Montana being one of the few exceptions where you have to have a just cause for being terminated. And so if I use this example all the time of, there was a worker in Minnesota who wore a Packers tie at his auto dealership, and the owner fired him because he was wearing the wrong color tie. And that's inappropriate, who knows how good of a salesman he was? It's totally inappropriate, and and to be fired for just the color of your tie is just not how we should be doing things in this country.
No, absolutely not. And we see people being monitored for bathroom usage and just all sorts of things that are, it kind of takes away personal dignity as well as personal rights. Yeah. So anything else? We got about a minute left that we should talk about before, have we basically covered the legislative agenda? Yeah,
obviously we spent a lot of time on trade as well. The steelworkers are our most active union on trade issues, and for us, it's about ensuring that there's a level workplace and a level playing field between international players, and quite frankly, raising wages in Mexico. When we look at the Goodyear tire plant in Topeka, Kansas, our members there make a good salary, a good middle-class income of about $23 to $27 an hour. In Mexico, there's a Goodyear plant producing the same tires that are competing with U.S. Our members, and they're getting paid $1.88 an hour effectively. And so we have to raise wages in Mexico and improve workers' rights there so that we actually give them the dignity of work and also maintain a competitiveness between the two countries.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And listen, I support everything you guys are trying to do, so keep up the great work. We've been talking with Roy Houseman, legislative representative for the United Steelworkers. Roy, thanks for coming on the program.
Hey, no, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.